Welcome, kids! I'm in my porta, backyardia. This is your week in review. So in math this week, we started a new unit, probability. So you had two sets of boom cards, one for 5.1 and the other one for 5.2. For each of the lessons, there was a video lesson if you wanted me to kind of go through it, talk about it a little bit. Okay, but you want to look at all of the different notes that you had to write down, for instance, reminders of how to calculate decimals to percents, decimals to fractions, percents to decimals, fractions to decimals, so on and so forth. So there were all these reminders in our first one. And then a little warm up. But understanding what probability is the most important part of 5.1 and just how to recognize it and what events are. And certain events, impossible events, favorable outcomes, possible outcomes, how each of them are the notation for it. So the probability of X, which is denoted as P, open bracket, X, right over here, probability of X occurring, which can be expressed in a fraction, percentage, ratio, or a decimal. Okay, and looking at the different ways that it can be expressed, such as a fraction, a decimal, a percentage, or even a ratio, which would be something that would be new to all of us. But the ratio is very, very similar to a fraction. It's kind of like a fraction on its side. So you work through the boom cards, and then you would be doing workbook questions, pages, 50 to 51, 52 to 53. After you finish your workbook questions, please don't forget, take a picture, scan it, whatever you can do, but you want to add it on to your assignment so that I can check that you've actually done that work in your workbook. Add the picture to the assignment for 5.1. So after looking at probability and what it is, we looked at how do you organize all of these events and these outcomes that happen. So there's again another optional video link that you can go to, and I walk you through it. So when you're working with these things called sample spaces, these are all the possible outcomes of an experiment. Okay. You can use a table to organize all of the outcomes. So with the table, you can have, for this example, was the spinner and the cards. You just need to choose what you're going to put where. So on this side, we had the spinner, and on this top piece, we had the cards. So when you're filling that out, you just want to be consistent if you're using, for example, the spinner first, then the cards, or if you're using the cards first, then the spinner. And you want to label them accordingly. So this example in the front was tiger and hungry. So you can have tiger and hungry. So we put the tiger first, then the hungry, tiger, then sleepy, tiger first, then sleepy, or bear and sleepy. So you can see how we're just using these rows and columns to help create the outcomes. Next, you have a tree diagram. Now, tree diagrams, I know for some people may be a little bit trickier, but you just kind of think of it as following a path. You're creating paths that you need to follow. So you start with a dot, and then you first put out the first set of outcomes. Okay. Then after that, you add on to each of these the next set of outcomes. So in this case, we started with hungry, then we added on tiger, monkey, bear to each of these 4 outcomes. And then after that, when you're trying to figure out, well, what are the different types of outcomes? You're just following a path. You're just following a path. So I like to think of a tree diagram as also following a path. Okay, in your workbook again, you are working on pages 54 to 55. Once you're done, take a picture, upload it onto Google Classroom for 5.2 organized outcomes so that I know that you've done those 2 pages. Okay, for science 3.3 properties of materials in plants and animal structures. So it's pretty much being a structure ourselves, where, for example, our skeleton is a frame structure. We've talked about that probably around the start of the unit. So what makes up that structure? The material would be bones. There's also ligaments and cartilage. So ligaments, so here's an example. The thigh bone is connected to the shin bone by a ligament. Okay, so those are the bands. They're strong, they're flexible, connective tissue. So it connects the thigh bone and the shin bone. So that would be an example of a ligament. Cartilage, it's at the end of some of the bones, and it's really kind of almost rubbery. Sometimes if you're eating chicken, you have the bone and then you have that weird kind of rubbery, white, clearish, almost translucent piece. That would be cartilage. So then we looked at muscles, and muscles allow the body to actually move around. So if you have weak muscles, you can't move as much, or if you have little muscles, if your muscles are stronger, then you can lift more, it can hold more weight or that force. So muscles are connected to the bones by tendons. So tendons are strong and flexible, and tendons will often hold together even when the bone to which it is connected breaks. So if the bone breaks, the tendon is still going to hold the bone together unless that had used a lot more force to break the tendon. So when a muscle contracts, then the bone will move. So for example, the heart is a muscle. So when it contracts, it pumps blood throughout our entire body. The digestive tract muscles, they contract and help move food along to where it needs to go, usually exiting out. So joints. When I think of a joint, I always think of the joints of a door that allow the door to open and close. So if you think of your door, even go to a door now and look what's holding the door to the wall. Those would be examples of joints, and that would be an example of actually a hinge joint. Sorry. Okay, so they have different functions. For example, the ball and socket joints, or you would find them in your shoulders, and then you find them in your hips. The elbows and the knees, they're like a hinge joint as well. And then there's pivot joints in your spinal column and gliding joints in your wrists. And these all allow for that movement. And the website on the next slide gives you a little example of how these actually move and how your body would move with it. Now the skin. The skin would be an example of a shell structure. It covers the entire body, and it's actually waterproof. It helps to prevent bacteria from entering your body and helps regulate temperature. And it's very important because it helps keep everything in. As we said, shell structures are very strong until a little piece of it is broken. So now when we looked at a tree, they have different layers of material that pretty much make up the tree. We would say the tree trunk, and even the tree branches. Okay, so you have the outer bark, you have the inner bark, and you have this cambium cell layer. So we did include a picture of that, but that's the part that actually grows in the tree. Okay, you also have what is called the sapwood, which is that pipeline for moving the water. So when rain falls or when someone waters the tree, it pretty much allows the tree to get all of its water. And then the heartwood, which is that central supporting pillar of the tree. So kind of like the heart is the muscle that needs to keep pumping to keep you alive. The heartwood, you can think, well, that's supporting the tree to also stay alive. Okay, and this is our example. So you can see there's the heartwood there, and you have that outer bark, which would be equivalent to our skin. And then that's the pith right here. And then, oh, it's hard to see, but the cambium layer is this layer right here, which is the part that actually grows. Next, we had 4.1, building safe structures in all environments. So the first thing was the margin of safety. The margin of safety is the limit within a structure that allows it to perform its function safely. So, for example, you might see when you're driving with family, or if you're on city transit, you might see pictures that looks like a car skidding off the road, and it's just kind of letting you know, hey, when it's raining or when it's snowing, it's slippery on this road when you're driving. Be careful. Speed limits, that's another example of margin of safety. In an elevator, it tells you how much weight or mass that is allowed within an elevator before it stops working properly. There is also a slide on testing for structural safety. So everything needs to be tested to make sure that it's going to withstand even the greatest amount of force possible. So I had included two videos. One was a crash test with a car, and another was a hockey helmet test. So they have to use extreme cases to see, okay, well, when is this going to really fail? So usually when you're testing for structural safety, or you send something out into the world for people to use, you still have to monitor it. So for example, you might hear sometimes that a car has been recalled. That means maybe they were getting lots of people complaining about certain parts of the car, or the car's just not functioning properly. So then they'd have to recall it. So they've gathered lots of information. So people complaining about the cars, or maybe mechanics are noticing, hey, this part, every time I, fix these cars, it always seems to be this particular part, and how many of these types of parts are ordered. And so they're looking at all of that data, and then they have to do further testing. So they'll use graphs to actually monitor um, that the structural safety, and they'll do it over time, and they'll see, maybe it was just a bad batch, maybe it was between this year and last year that it was actually not a really good year to be using certain parts, certain types of paint. So these are the things that would be for monitoring that structural safety, is when they're using surveys, asking people, or getting data from consumers. So there are three types of environmental factors. There's climatic conditions, terrain conditions, and earthquake risk. So depending on those types of environmental factors, and they have to make sure that the structures can withstand these types of factors. Climatic conditions would be, how does the climate affect the structure? So the next video looks at how a lot of snowfall actually made a roof collapse. Terrain conditions, look at where the actual structure is being built. So that foundation of the structure. If it's going to be on the edge of a cliff, an edge of a cliff, what happens over time when rain and maybe snow or wind to that cliff? It could start eroding. And then the structure would probably tip over. If it's close to a mountain, then avalanches can happen. So that would be terrain conditions. How does it change the foundation of the structure? And if a structure is being built in an area that is highly, highly prone, or a place that has lots and lots of earthquakes, that's what prone means, then the structure needs to be able to withstand these earthquakes, and very high earthquakes, because otherwise that's when your structure will fail. And when during an earthquake, you want it to protect the people, not to kill them. Okay, so that would be it for science. So you had those two Nearpods. At the end of each, it has a quiz. If you are not able to do the quiz on Nearpod, you need to let me know so that I can give you the quiz through Google. I will try and update these grades on the weekend or next week sometime. So if you want to get credit for it, you need to do these quizzes. And that's your week in review.